This is the third audio lecture for week 11 material, DNA biology, evolution, and immunology. And this is just a short summary of evolution. So when we look at the concept of evolution, biological evolution or change over time. So what we're talking about is how species change over long periods of time in response to the environment, and we're going to talk about the concept of natural selection. What we say is that organisms respond by having adaptations to characteristics that make them more able to survive and reproduce in the environment. So if an organism has an adaptation or a characteristic that makes them more able to survive in their environment, then they are more likely to survive and reproduce. And so their genes will be more likely to be passed on to the next generation. So the characteristics that those genes are giving those organisms are going to become more common in the population. I just wanted to touch on a little kind of side concept, is that evolution usually takes a long time, but we do have evidence of evolution that can happen over very short periods of time. In fact, next week in lab, I'm going to show you the example of how some bacteria, you can see the evolution in a bacterial population over 11 days. And so it depends on the situation, but most of the time evolution is taking place over extremely long periods of times, not just days. And so what organisms are doing is they have different characteristics. So if we look in a population, we look around at your classmates and we realize, or look at any group of people, we all look kind of different. And so we have genetic variety among us. And some of us have characteristics that are going to make us more able to survive in the environments or adaptations. So the concept of natural selection is really the mechanism by which evolution occurs. And you've heard of natural selection being called the survival of the fittest. So in the example on the right here, that we have variation in a population, and that what they're finding, if the food source is up very high, the taller individuals are going to be able to eat more food and more likely to be able to reproduce. And therefore, their genes are going to be passed into the next generation. So the survival of the fittest, in this case, the fittest is going to be the taller organisms. And so what happens is the population generally, in this case, would become taller. And because they're going to have more genes for tall. And so if we look at this original population, that there was a lot of variety in neck length of these giraffes, over time, you're going to find your populations are going to have more individuals are going to have that beneficial trait. And that's really the concept of evolution. And I just want to emphasize down here that there's some things that have to occur. There has to be a variation in your group. So there has to be some genetic variety. And so when we mentioned mutations in the previous video, the idea of having mutations can be good for a population because that's going to give you some variety in all sorts of different traits. And if you have competition for resources, you're going to be something that's going to cause the individuals in this population to compete, whether it's resources or food or mates or space or whatever it is. You get some competition, and so what's going to happen is that variety, there's going to be certain ones that have characteristics that are going to allow them to compete better, and then they're going to adapt to their environment, and we're going to select for certain traits that make it more beneficial in that environment. So the one thing why I said at the beginning that it takes a long time for evolution to occur is one of the things that's occurring right now with climate change is environments are changing very quickly. And this is much more quickly than a population can adapt. For example, I know one of the things happening in the polar regions in the North Pole is polar bears are, they would do most of their eating at the time when the ice froze and they could get way out into the water and have access to food that they wouldn't when the ice wasn't there. And so very quickly the environment is changing, but there's not enough time for these populations to adapt. It's just happening so suddenly that instead of being able to get used to this, a gradual change over time, and select for individuals that are more fit for the environment, it's just killing them. It's just too fast. It's killing the individuals and they're not having a chance to reproduce. So polar bear populations have really gone down because of starvation. They're not getting enough food. And so they don't have a chance to pass on traits from one generation to the next. If the ice changed gradually over many, many years, you'd be able to select for those individuals that could gradually be selected for to be the better hunters. So evolution generally takes time. And I'm going to stop right there.